Welcome to the case analysis of Estate of Tecumseh versus Chickasaw Nation Department of Commerce. This case focuses on the critical issue of individual property rights versus tribal regulatory authority. The estate argues for institutional restraint, asserting that cultural exhibits are non-commercial. The CNDOC argues that sovereignty is absolute and that gray market gaming threatens the nation's economic integrity. Our video overview covers three main areas: legal foundations, property protections, and sovereign policing power. We will examine the inherent authority of tribal nations to govern commerce and assess heightened legal protections for fee-simple land against arbitrary assessments. Finally, we'll look at regulatory fees as a valid exercise of sovereign policing power. The core dispute concerns a retroactive assessment of over $450,000 in gaming fees imposed on a cultural exhibit located on privately held fee-simple land. The central legal question is whether the nation's sovereign regulatory reach extends to non-commercial cultural activity on this private land. The appellant is the estate of Silas H. Tecumseh, representing private landholders within tribal jurisdictional boundaries. The respondent is the Chickasaw Nation Department of Commerce, or CNDOC, the regulatory arm responsible for gaming oversight and enforcement. The land in question is designated as fee-simple land, held in private ownership. The Tecumseh Cultural Center, located on the land, operates as a non-commercial educational exhibit for heritage preservation. The core jurisdictional conflict is whether tribal gaming laws can be applied to this specific private parcel. The exhibit's purpose was to be a specialized interpretive center for traditional Chickasaw games. However, CNDOC regulators retroactively reclassified it as an unregulated gaming facility under the nation's gaming regulatory framework. This reclassification resulted in a $450,000 regulatory fee imposition, despite the exhibit's non-commercial status. In 2022, the CNDOC retroactively classified the land as subject to the gaming regulatory framework. The functional justification was that the presence of traditional games meant the area functioned identically to gaming. This regulatory outcome stripped the exhibit of its cultural education status and imposed immediate fee obligations. The CNDOC finalized a retroactive assessment of $450,000 in gaming regulatory fees. This was calculated as if the cultural exhibit were a commercial-grade gaming facility. This assessment created immediate fee obligations, stripping the exhibit of its financial exemptions. The district court upheld the nation's sovereignty, ruling that its authority extends to all lands within its historic boundaries, including fee-simple parcels. This judicial determination affirmed the CNDOC's inherent power to regulate gaming-like activities, reinforcing the Montana Doctrine exceptions. The estate's appeal raises three main issues: subject matter jurisdiction, procedural due process, and regulatory scope. They question whether the Montana Doctrine grants jurisdiction over non-members without a consensual relationship, whether the retroactive reclassification violated fair notice, and the limits of inherent sovereign power over non-commercial private activities. The first point of error focuses on the scope of regulation. The appellant argues the CNDOC exceeded its delegated authority by applying commercial gaming regulations to a non-commercial educational exhibit. They contend the Montana Doctrine's consensual relationship exception is not met, as the exhibit was purely educational, not commercial, and sovereignty should be tethered to actual conduct. The Montana Framework's general rule bars tribal civil jurisdiction over non-members on fee lands. Exceptions exist for consensual relationships or conduct that has a direct effect on tribal integrity, economic security, or welfare. The Marion precedent supports the core argument that regulatory authority is tethered strictly to the conduct itself, not merely the territory. The estate contends that mere imitation of traditional games for cultural pedagogy does not equate to commercial gaming commerce and fails to trigger the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. The interpretive framework requires tribal regulations to adhere to the plain meaning of economic activity, limiting regulatory reach. The estate argues cultural education is not commerce, requiring regulatory restraint. Chickasaw Nation versus U.S. is cited as a shield against administrative overreach, demanding an explicit nexus to actual gaming commerce. The second point of error asserts due process violations. The assessment lacked a substantial evidentiary nexus to actual gaming commerce. Furthermore, the CNDOC failed to provide a meaningful hearing before imposing the financial burden, violating procedural fairness and the Chickasaw Constitution's due process protections. The estate contends the imposed $450,000 fee is arbitrary due to a lack of evidentiary nexus. The fee was imposed without a factual basis, linking the cultural exhibit to commercial gaming revenue or impact. Legal precedent requires a substantial evidentiary connection between the regulated activity and the administrative burden. Under the Matthews v. Eldridge balancing test, the administrative action fails. The private interest involves a significant deprivation of property without notice. The risk of erroneous deprivation was high, as the CNDOC relied on speculation instead of factual data. The administrative efficiency of the government does not outweigh the fundamental fairness required. The Chickasaw Constitution provides crucial property protections. Article 3, the Bill of Rights, asserts that no citizen shall be deprived of property without due process. This due process shield requires fundamental fairness and notice before imposing punitive fees, supporting robust indigenous administrative law. The appellant's theory advocates for sovereignty with restraint. Sovereignty is viewed as a delegated trust, not absolute power, bound by constitutional limits. Regulatory authority requires a factual connection, an economic nexus, to the activity taxed. True sovereign strength lies in the protection of the individual's due process rights. The respondent's theory asserts absolute territorial power. They define sovereignty by the exclusive control over all persons and property within the nation's borders. The power to tax and regulate is an inherent attribute of tribal status, requiring judicial deference to administrative actions that serve the collective interest. This case presents a landmark challenge in balancing culture and commerce. It requires reconciling individual property rights with tribal regulatory authority to prevent administrative overreach. The court must articulate the boundary between cultural traditionalism and commercial gaming to establish robust indigenous administrative law.